Some homes don't feel heavy because they're full, but because certain parts of them have been waiting quietly for attention for a very long time. If you've ever walked through your own space and felt that quiet pull, not stress, not mess, just a sense of something unfinished, then you'll understand Margaret. She lives alone now, in the same house that once held the rhythm of long workdays and busy evenings. The days move differently here. Mornings arrive without urgency, afternoons stretch a little longer, and yet the house still seems to expect the pace of an earlier life. There's no crisis pressing on her, just a low, steady feeling of obligation, as though the space itself hasn't realized things have changed. Certain rooms feel like they're waiting for her to catch up, to keep doing what she used to do, even though her life has already shifted. This is where today's conversation begins. Not with a plan or a push to act, but with a moment of recalibration. The quiet recognition that doing more isn't the answer anymore. Staying here offers a softer way of relating to space and time, a way of noticing what's been postponed without judgment, and without the need to resolve everything at once. Wise Aging Seniors exists for moments like this. It's a shared space for people navigating later seasons of life with awareness, whether you live alone, with a partner, or somewhere in between. There's no hurry here, no expectation to perform, just room to slow down and notice what's really asking for your attention. And once that noticing begins, something else naturally follows. Because awareness has a way of opening doors, and what comes next often surprises us. The first thing Margaret becomes aware of isn't a pile of things or a surface that needs clearing. It's a feeling. Certain rooms seem to carry more noise than others, even when they look fine. Not sound exactly, more like pressure. A sense that the room is holding on to an older script and waiting for her to step back into it. She notices it most when she slows down. When she walks into the spare room or pauses near the doorway of a space she doesn't quite use anymore, there's a subtle tightening. Nothing is out of order, yet her shoulders lift slightly, as if she's being asked a question she hasn't answered. The room doesn't feel messy. It feels expectant. What's different this time is that she doesn't rush past the feeling. She doesn't distract herself or mentally schedule it for another day. She stands there a little longer than usual. No decisions, no plans, just noticing how the space makes her feel in her body, the weight in her chest, the quiet resistance in her steps. And in that pause, something becomes clear. This heaviness isn't coming from the objects themselves. It's coming from what they represent. Old routines, old responsibilities, versions of her life that once made sense, but don't quite fit the way her days move now. The room isn't asking to be cleaned, it's asking to be understood. There's a kind of relief in realizing that. Because if the weight didn't arrive all at once, then it doesn't need to be solved all at once either. These feelings have been accumulating gently over time, layered over years of being busy, capable, and constantly needed. Of putting things aside with the promise that they'd be dealt with later. Margaret allows herself to acknowledge that without judgment. She doesn't label it as a problem. She doesn't push herself to act. She simply lets the awareness settle. That some spaces are loud, not because they're full, but because they're holding unfinished conversations from earlier seasons of life. And once you notice that, it changes how you move through your home. You stop seeing rooms as tasks waiting to be completed, and start sensing them as signals, messages about where time has passed, where energy shifted, and where something might be ready, not to be cleared yet, but to be reconsidered. That realization opens the door to the next layer. Because once you understand that a room can hold expectations, it naturally raises another question. How many of those expectations were meant to be temporary, but quietly stayed behind? As Margaret sits with that awareness, another understanding begins to take shape. Quieter, but just as steady. Many of the things around her didn't stay because she chose them again and again. They stayed because choosing felt like something she could return to later. And for a long time, later worked. Life was full, energy was spoken for, and postponing certain decisions felt practical, even responsible. Later became a kind of storage space of its own, a place where unresolved choices could rest without demanding attention. Not because they didn't matter, but because everything else mattered more at the time. Work, commitments, keeping things moving. The house absorbed those pauses without complaint, holding on to them quietly. Now, in this slower season, those delayed decisions have a different presence. They're no longer hidden by busyness. Margaret notices how some items don't stir emotion or attachment. They stir a question. One she answered internally many times, but never out loud. She finds herself standing near the same shelf, the same drawer, the same corner, already knowing what the decision would be if she allowed herself to finish it. This time, she doesn't rush to do anything with that knowing. She simply admits it, just to herself. No follow-through required, no pressure to act. There's a surprising calm in acknowledging what's already settled internally, even if nothing changes physically yet. That small admission does something important. It separates urgency from truth. Margaret realizes she doesn't need to force momentum in order to be honest. Sometimes clarity comes from letting a decision exist fully in your mind before it ever reaches your hands. And as that settles, a deeper question begins to form, one that goes beyond any single object or space. Who were these decisions meant to serve in the first place? The version of her who needed to keep everything open-ended? The one who couldn't afford to slow down? Or the person she is now, living days that no longer demand the same kind of holding pattern? That question lingers, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully. Because once you see that many things stayed simply because life moved faster than choice, it becomes easier to imagine that some of those choices are ready to belong to the present instead. Not acted on yet, just re-owned. And with that realization, another layer begins to come into focus. Because not everything that stayed was waiting for a decision. Some things were waiting for permission to belong, or not belong, to who she has become. After sitting with those postponed decisions, Margaret notices another shift. Not in the room, but in how she's relating to herself inside it. There are objects around her that don't feel unresolved or confusing anymore. They feel familiar, almost friendly. And yet they also feel slightly out of place, like they're anchored to a rhythm her life no longer keeps. These are the things that once made perfect sense. They belonged to days that were fuller, bodies that recovered faster, roles that required more output than reflection. Back then they fit seamlessly into who she needed to be. Now they don't create discomfort so much as a quiet mismatch. Not wrong, just no longer aligned. What surprises Margaret is that noticing this doesn't bring sadness. It brings clarity. There's relief in admitting that change has already happened, whether the space has acknowledged it or not. She isn't losing a version of herself, she's recognizing that she's already moved on. Something subtle shifts in the way she asks questions. Instead of wondering whether something is still useful, she pays attention to whether it still belongs, whether it supports how her days unfold now, whether it respects the pace she naturally keeps. The question isn't practical, it's personal. She notices how this reframing softens everything. The space feels less demanding, less insistent. There's no internal debate, no need to justify or defend, just a quieter sense of alignment, as though the room itself relaxes once she stops measuring herself against who she used to be. This change in self-relationship alters how she moves through her home. There's less pressure to maintain appearances, fewer silent comparisons to earlier standards. She feels more present, more rooted in the version of herself that exists today, not the one she once needed to be. And as that honesty settles in, the space around her begins to feel different. Not because anything has been removed yet, but because the expectations have shifted. The house no longer feels like it's asking her to perform an earlier life. That realization carries forward, because when you stop arranging your space for who you were, it opens the door to something else entirely, a way of living that feels lighter, not because there's less, but because what remains finally fits. Once that alignment settles in, the house seems to respond in ways Margaret didn't expect. Nothing dramatic happens, no sweeping changes, no sudden emptiness. And yet moving through certain rooms feels easier, almost as if the space has exhaled along with her. She notices it in small moments, the way she passes through a doorway without hesitation, or how she no longer feels the need to brace herself before entering certain areas. Some corners feel calmer now, not because they've been cleared, but because they're no longer asking her to maintain an old arrangement. The tension she once felt there has softened. It's replaced by a sense of neutrality, even quiet support. The house doesn't feel like a set of tasks anymore. It feels more like a place that's listening. Margaret finds herself making one small choice rooted in ease. She lets a surface stay simpler. She leaves a space as it is without filling it back in out of habit. There's no announcement, no explanation, no inner debate about whether it looks right or makes sense. It simply feels better this way. That choice has a ripple effect. Without meaning to, she begins to move differently. She takes a seat without adjusting everything around her. She rests without scanning the room for what still needs attention. The space starts to accommodate her rather than the other way around. What's most striking is how natural it feels. There's no sense of loss, no worry about permanence, just a quiet recognition that comfort matters now, and that ease doesn't need to be earned. Allowing a room to be calmer is not a sign of giving up. It's a sign of listening to the life that's actually being lived. This shift opens something deeper. Margaret realizes that when space stops demanding, attention becomes available. Not for more tasks, but for presence. For noticing how she feels as she moves, rests, and breathes within her own home. And with that awareness comes the sense that this experience isn't really about the house at all. It's about what happens when you let your environment reflect the season you're in, and how much lighter life can feel when it does. As these small shifts settle, a larger understanding begins to take shape, one that reframes everything Margaret has been noticing. What's been weighing on her isn't really the presence of things. It's the quiet agreements tied to them. Agreements she made years ago, often without realizing it, about who she needed to be, how much she should hold, and what it meant to be responsible. Those agreements were useful once. They helped her navigate busy seasons, meet expectations, and keep life moving forward. But time has changed the conditions. The pace is different now. The demands are different. And yet many of those internal contracts have remained in place, quietly influencing how she relates to her space. Margaret begins to see that clearing isn't about deciding what stays or goes. It's about recognizing which expectations no longer apply. When she loosens her grip on the idea that everything needs a future purpose, or that comfort must be justified, the space responds almost immediately. Not because anything has been removed, but because the pressure behind it has lifted. There's something deeply relieving about that realization. It means she doesn't have to negotiate with every object or explain her choices to anyone, not even herself. She can allow her environment to reflect who she is now, without carrying forward agreements that belong to a different chapter of life. This understanding shifts the tone of the entire home. Rooms no longer feel like they're waiting for decisions or performance. They feel present, supportive, aligned with the way her days actually unfold. The space begins to feel less like a record of the past and more like a companion to the present. What makes this insight powerful is how quietly it works. There's no force involved, no demand for momentum, just a steady release of expectations that no longer fit. And in that release, Margaret discovers that the space doesn't need to be managed. It simply needs permission to change along with her. Once those silent agreements loosen, everything else follows naturally. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but in a way that feels respectful of time, energy, and the life she's living now. When we return to Margaret, there's no dramatic before and after. The house looks much the same, but the way she moves through it has shifted. There's less hesitation in her steps, fewer pauses filled with internal debate. She no longer feels the need to mentally explain herself as she passes through certain rooms, or justify why something is still there, or why something else no longer matters. What's changed is quieter than action. She reaches for things without bracing. She sits without scanning the space for what should be addressed next. The running commentary that once followed her from room to room has softened, not disappeared, just loosened enough to give her some breathing room. Nothing feels finished, and that no longer bothers her. There's comfort in knowing she doesn't have to bring anything to a neat conclusion. The pressure to get it all done has eased, replaced by a sense that this is an ongoing relationship with her space, one that can evolve gently, at her pace. She notices how this lightness affects her attention. With fewer silent negotiations happening in the background, her mind feels less crowded. Moments stretch a little longer. She lingers where she feels comfortable and passes easily through places that no longer hold weight. The house feels less like a list of expectations and more like a setting that supports her days as they are now. This new quiet creates room for something else to emerge, not another task, but curiosity. Curiosity about what she actually enjoys having around her, about which spaces invite rest and which invite movement, about how her home might continue to change if it's allowed to respond to her life, rather than the other way around. Margaret doesn't label this as progress. She doesn't frame it as an achievement. She simply notices that living this way feels kinder. And that kindness, once felt, has a way of inviting the next gentle shift, whatever that may be. Sometimes the most meaningful shift isn't choosing less, but choosing what aligns, allowing ease to guide decisions as time becomes something you protect, not rush through. Thank you for staying in this quiet space today. Taking time to reflect like this, without pressure, without needing immediate answers, matters more than it often feels like it does. These moments of noticing and realignment are how change begins gently in ways that last. If this reflection resonated with you and you'd like to support this message reaching others who might need it, there's a simple way to do that using the Hype feature on YouTube. When you're on the app, scroll down and swipe left on the comment preview carousel until you see the Hype button. Tap it, choose how many points you'd like to give, and confirm your selection. Smaller creators receive a larger boost, and YouTube gives every viewer 3 free hypes each week. Each one helps this video rise on the leaderboard so more people can discover conversations like this. You may also see a Hype Star badge, a small sign of community support that helps keep this space growing. If you'd like to stay connected, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future reflections. There's no rush, just an open invitation to return whenever you need a calmer perspective. We're building wise aging seniors together, slowly and intentionally, a place where lived experience is honoured. Change is allowed to unfold at its own pace, and every season of life is met with respect.